Known as the Gateway to the West, St. Louis, Missouri served as the launching pad for the Lewis and Clark expedition and westward expansion of the United States during the 19th century. Tourists now come for the Arch, the Cardinals and the Blues, and the city's many cultural and historical attractions. But you have to cross the Mississippi River into Illinois to visit Cahokia Mounds to get a taste of St. Louis's original claim to fame.
I can't tell you how much I've heard about the World's Fair over the course of my life, or different aspects of St. Louis history, but never about its indigenous past. St. Louis was an international tourist destination in the early 1800s. European aristocrats and royalty and people from the East Coast came to St. Louis to see native peoples who were alive, wandering around, as well as these old mounds. So St. Louis had a really indigenous reputation, and I just became fascinated by how something could be so completely erased.
In Mound City, the place of the indigenous past and present in St. Louis, Patricia Cleary discusses the dark history surrounding the destruction of these ancient monuments and the mythology created to justify it.
Some people said these have to be natural phenomenon. Those who thought they were constructed by people argued that many of these mounds were constructed by a different race than contemporary native peoples. Maybe the Welsh built them.
The Welsh?
The Welsh. Maybe
okay.
The people of the lost continent of Atlantis.
Oh, that sounds logical. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe a lost tribe of Israel. Anybody but the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples. All of this is about the logic of territorial possession. If you can dissociate the people who live in a spot from the history of it, from the title to it, then you can use their land or take their land.
We're here today with Patricia Cleary with her brand new book, Mound City. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to talk about so much because I learned things that I never knew anything about. Mound City, I'd seen that moniker all over town, even growing up here from the 70s all the way up through now. What is a mound and why was St. Louis called Mound City?
A mound is a constructed earthwork built by native peoples across the eastern half of the continent over the course of millennia. And there were mounds of many different kinds. Conical mounds, some of them mortuary mounds, ridge-topped mounds that could also be mortuary, flat pyramid-like mounds that had temples and homes of the elite on them, defensive mounds, effigy mounds that looked like serpents and other animals. And there were tens of thousands of them in Missouri as late as the 1930s. And like you, I grew up in St. Louis, and the only mound I had ever heard of before I became a professional historian was Monk's Mound at Cahokia. I knew about Cahokia mounds, but I had no idea that there were mounds on this side of the river.
And you knew even more than I did. I didn't visit Cahokia Mounds for the first time until 15 years ago. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of these things, if it was in another country, on another continent, visitors would come from all over the place, and the people who lived in that town would know so much about that area with that kind of distinction around it. But your book focuses a lot on the mounds that were on this side of the river, on the Missouri side of the river. Where did they go, and what happened?
That's a really big question, and we start with Cahokia in general in thinking about mounds in this area, because Cahokia, or that wasn't its name at the time, but the settlement that was around Cahokia assumed its sort of modern incarnation almost 1,000 years ago. There was a huge wave of building around 1050 AD. And during that wave of construction, massive mounds were built that might have been built very quickly or might have taken decades to construct, millions of cubic feet of dirt that in 40, 50 pounds at a time, people hauling in baskets and putting on these mounds. And it was kind of ancient America's great metropolis, and that's how archaeologists refer to it. And as any metropolitan area is in the way we think about it today, there are sort of suburbs and satellites. So on the side of what's today East St. Louis, there was another complex. And on this side of the river, just a little bit north of where the Arch is, along Broadway, from about 0.8 mile to about 1.1 mile, if you were going north from the arch was another mound complex of about 27 mounds arranged around a plaza, absolutely unmistakable as human constructions, historic earthworks. And when the French began to settle in this area in the 1760s, there were indigenous settlements around of Peoria indigenous peoples, and the mounds were to the north of the colonial village. And it wasn't until the town began to grow to the west, to the south, and then eventually to the north in the 18 teens and 1820s that St. Louis kind of began to encroach on the mounds. And what happened over the course of a few decades, well, actually about 50 years, because there was no protection for these structures in place, is that people used them. So somebody built a house on top of one because it had a really good view out over the river. Early infrastructure projects like a reservoir to provide a steady water supply for the city took care of another one. And during the construction for that project, they exhumed lots and lots of human remains and artifacts. The biggest of the mounds, which was at its base the size of a football field, and the footprint of the new Stan Musial Veterans Memorial Bridge goes right across it.
Wow.
That mound was known as the Big Mound, and it was the biggest of them on this side of the river. 319 feet long, 30 to 40 feet high. And on the top of that mound in the 1840s, somebody built a big restaurant, the
Really?
Mound Pavilion, where you could go and take your friends and look at the river traffic and enjoy a meal.
This is a question I have in general about the mounds, but did people know what they were building on top of or looking out over? Did they know that these were ritualistic mounds of a previous civilization, or was it just a great big hill that happened to be around?
When the first Europeans were settling in the area, they called the biggest of the mounds the Grange de Terre, which is French for the earth barn, because that's kind of what it reminded them of. And the mounds by this time had not been inhabited or used by native peoples for a few hundred years. They were abandoned sometime between 1300 and definitely by 1400. We don't know exactly why. There are lots of different theories: environmental crises, social and political conflict, food shortages, resource shortages, but peoples moved out from them. Other indigenous peoples moved into the area, and the peoples who left built societies centered on mounds elsewhere, so that when De Soto and the Spanish came from Florida into what's today Arkansas in the 1540s, they encountered societies that were still centered around and building mounds. So Europeans had firsthand views of that mound building practice in recent time. Around St. Louis, there were questions. Some people said these have to be natural phenomenon, which seems kind of crazy. When you think about St. Louis as up on limestone bluffs, they were arguing that these mounds were left over from erosion and that the Mississippi had flooded and deposited dirt. But that doesn't explain everything around Cahokia. And it certainly doesn't explain perfectly symmetrical structures laid out around big square plazas. But there was a logic to this argument, and that is, if they're natural phenomenon, no person or no civilization is responsible for them. But all those early colonists and settlers had to do was ask the local tribes. So George Rogers Clark, the brother of William Clark of Lewis and Clark expedition fame, in Illinois was looking at the mounds around Cahokia, and he asked a Kaskaskia chief, Jean-Baptiste Ducoin, what do you know about the mounds? And Ducoin's response was, my ancestors built them. We were very numerous. We built many mounds. White Americans could access this indigenous historical knowledge, and most people, not George Rogers Clark, but most people discounted it. There was kind of this unwillingness to accept indigenous knowledge sources. So what they argued was that many of these mounds, those who thought they were constructed by people, were constructed by a different race than contemporary native peoples. Maybe the Welsh built them.
The Welsh.
The Welsh. Maybe the people of the lost continent of Atlantis.
Oh, that sounds logical. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe a lost tribe of Israel. Anybody but the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples. So there are a lot of cockamamie theories around. And there's another theory that, in fact, the ancestors of contemporary native peoples not only did not build the mounds, but that their ancestors were savage and had killed a superior, different race of people who had built the mounds. All of this is about the logic of territorial possession. If you can dissociate the people who live in a spot from the history of it, from the title to it, then you can use their land or take their land.
So that is the logic that was used in order to take over the land, to expand further west and to make St. Louis what it was.
It's so complicated because there are these simultaneous trends. One is to see indigenous peoples in the 1800s as being destined to die out, to vanish, the vanishing Indian myth. And that basically argued they were either going to vanish because they were going to die out numerically, and if you have genocidal wars of aggression against them, that's not surprising, but that's not the way U.S. policymakers talked about it. Or they were going to vanish because they were going to be fully assimilated and be indistinguishable from the rest of the population on the grounds of language, religious practice, customs. So on the one hand, there's an idea that indigenous people are going to vanish. On the other hand, there's an argument that they are uncivilized and that they don't have a place. And those two ideas kind of go hand in hand. When it comes to the mounds, white Americans have a desire to possess them and to see them as part of their own history. And indigenous scholars write about this. It's an idea of sort of firsting and lasting. So the indigenous people may have been the first ones on the spot, and the ancient ones built these amazing mounds. And then there's kind of this intervening, less civilized people who maybe destroyed them, and the white Americans are going to come in, get rid of those contemporary peoples, and assume the mantle of civilization, continue it that the first people did. So the firsters and the lasters go together. So you can claim Mound City as your own.
It's kind of interesting now you talk about you get to claim the mounds and to claim all that, but at least with the mounds that were on the Missouri side of the Mississippi River, the mounds don't exist anymore. They were all razed.
That's right.
And there were places, and I grew up seeing things called Mound City, but I've also flown in on a plane. When you fly into St. Louis and you're coming in over Illinois, it is extraordinarily flat, but that's not the way it used to be.
No, and there were maybe 120 mounds around Cahokia, and now, I mean, there are major roads running right through that historic site. And in St. Louis, the only mound that remains identifiable within the city limits is Sugarloaf Mound, which is just off of Highway 55, close to the South Broadway exit. And that mound has its own kind of distinct history and place, but it wasn't encroached on in the same way that the city, as it moved northward, encroached on the main mound complex.
Can you talk about that mound?
Sure. So Sugarloaf Mound, and I don't know if you've ever gotten off the freeway there to go and look at it. And I looked it up one time for the Missouri Department of Transportation statistics, and about 100,000 people drive by that mound every day. The question is, how many of them know it's there? I mean, the ground is hilly around there, and you're on a freeway. But when you get off and you look at the mound, you can see that it has levels and platforms. And there were 3 houses built on it in, I think, the 1940s or 1950s. The one on the top went on the market for sale in maybe 2008, and the Osage Nation, now headquartered in Oklahoma, and that was one of the historic peoples in this area who were removed. The Osage bought the house on the top, and they have removed the house that was there. The other 2 houses, one of them is owned by an elderly woman who's lived in the house since I think she was maybe 4 years old, who is not yet ready to leave it. And the one on the bottom is owned by a pharmacy college in the city and occupied by a fraternity. And it sounds like that organization has not yet been willing to sell it. But what the Osage Nation Tribal Heritage Preservation Office and Osage leaders hope to do is to repatriate that land, or rematriate, some people say, and to have a small interpretive center on the site, and to use the site as a way to come back to St. Louis in some sense, because they were removed, and between 1842 and 1909, it was actually against the state laws of Missouri for indigenous peoples to reside in the state.
Really?
Yes.
That late?
Yes, and there were native peoples who lived here, but it was illegal for them to be here. And they didn't have citizenship until 1924, and there wasn't universal native peoples suffrage in the U.S. until 1957. So it's a very recent history, this history of dispossession. It
was still shocking to me how much I learned just by going through your book, and how little, if not nothing, we are taught about, and the erasure of the physical presence of the previous residents of the land in which I was born. And I absolutely share your experience. You know, it was my own ignorance and recognition of it that really led me to think about and question not only what had happened to these mounds, which must have been incredible to see. I mean, 27 mounds arranged around a plaza, a mound known as Falling Gardens that had tiers, this big mound the size of a football field. I mean, they would have been incredible to look at. And how could they be gone? How could I not know about them? How, as a historian, did I not even hear of them till I was a professional historian? And I grew up in a family where my dad loved to talk about St. Louis history. I can't tell you how much I've heard about the World's Fair over the course of my life, or different aspects of St. Louis history, but never about its indigenous past. And so that ignorance is part of what fueled my own inquiry. And what I really was hoping to do with the book was to share as much as I could about the details of what happened to those mounds, how they were seen, explained, used, repurposed, and destroyed, and also to try to understand why we didn't learn about it. And you mentioned 1904. Was there a mound in Forest Park near what is now called Art Hill, where the art museum is? Yes, there were several mounds, and there was a Harvard archaeologist and anthropologist who was charged with excavating them and exploring them. His name was Bushnell, and he was really pleased that the people who were going to be developing the ground for the World's Fair were committed to preserving them. Well, that was 1902. By 1904, they were gone. They weren't really huge monumental earthworks, but they were nonetheless a series of indigenous mounds and structures. There were some human remains there, and those were destroyed as well. So what's called Art Hill, where as a modern day St. Louis sort of tradition, when it does snow, people go and use that hill, that is not actually one of the mounds. No, and that's one of the things that's tricky about a city like St. Louis, is because it is so hilly. You know, sometimes I drive around thinking, could that be a mound? Could that be a mound? And also, if these structures were not used and not maintained for a couple of centuries, they would have suffered a significant amount of erosion. There would have been a lot of plants, shrubs, even large trees growing on them. So I could imagine how some, let's say, much, much smaller ones might have looked like natural features, but the big ones, no. Is there currently any study, given satellite technology and all other sorts of stuff, as well as on-the-ground archaeology work, being done to find out if they do extend further out than where you may have thought before? Well, so within the city limits, I'm not aware of any that exist today besides Sugarloaf Mound. There are mounds in the county, and there are mounds still all over the state. Most of them are on private property. We don't necessarily know where all of them are. People don't necessarily want to disclose their locations. They continued to be destroyed. There were some that were destroyed in the county, I think, about 20 years ago, more or less. Were they knowingly destroyed? Yes. If this were Machu Picchu, or if this was Chichen Itza, or let's go to Rome, that you have to have archaeologists clear everything. They don't build anything in Rome anymore because you have civilizations that are buried. Or if they were the terracotta warriors in Xi'an in China, you would not be able to do anything with that. Are there any laws in place that, hey, you actually have to investigate this and mitigate or save or catalog or do something, or you just can't build where we think these mounds actually exist?
Yes, now archaeologists are not in a position of being able to do the kind of digs that they did. I mean, archaeology back in the 19th century, when the discipline was just beginning, it was often the purview of gentlemen of leisure, sometimes physicians, people who were mound enthusiasts who had the money and time, and they would just dig into mounds. And they were grave robbers, in effect. They just wanted to collect stuff. And the federal government was involved in this process as well. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army is charged with collecting the skulls of indigenous people, and some of those are from very old cemeteries, and some of them were from cemeteries where people were buried weeks or a few months. And it was part of a 19th century scientific racism, pseudoscience, of you measure somebody's cranial capacity and develop this hierarchy of race. The guy who did this, Samuel Morton, people have looked at his data. He was falsifying data left and right to try to make it fit his racist categories. But so archaeologists can't just dig willy-nilly anymore. Now there's a lot of ground-penetrating radar that they use to try to see what they can learn about what's buried. So that's one thing that happens. The other is that the federal government requires, when federal dollars are involved, let's say in the construction of a new road or a bridge like the Stan Musial Bridge, they require on-site archaeologists to observe and to stop a dig or excavation that's for transportation purposes if they uncover anything that is an indigenous site or a significant archaeological remain, to do an investigation. And there's also efforts when new roads are being planned with federal dollars to find out who the historic tribal stakeholders might be in those areas, to gain information about whether or not new roads might cross ancient sites. But when land is held in private hands or there's private development, there are no regulations, and there are people who don't care. Or there are people who collect out of enthusiasm but who destroy archaeological records when they do so.
This sounds very familiar with the Black American cemeteries that were bulldozed and just kind of run over when they wanted to expand Lambert Airport. And there were graves and tombstones right at the edge of the airport. And I remember when they were expanding that sort of thing and the fights with that as well. And you're saying there are still no political efforts as far as you know that are in effect right now in order to kind of stop or to mitigate it. And then a follow-up to that, did they find anything when they built the Stan Musial Bridge? Because that's a very recent sort of construction.
Right, and they found material that was from early St. Louis history, but not from its earlier indigenous history. The mounds in that area had been leveled, the biggest one for landfill for railroad beds, but they had been graded to street level a long time ago. But the sites are still very much considered sacred to indigenous peoples. So there's NAGPR legislation that's supposed to stop this kind of destruction of sites, and in some ways it's mainly for the repatriation of human remains and sacred objects. There is also bipartisan legislation making its way through Congress, sponsored by Congress people in both Illinois and Missouri, to create a national historic park that would include Cahokia, the sites of Big Mound and Sugarloaf Mound, and other sites in Illinois. And if that gets its way through, eventually maybe there would be more attention to and protection for those sites in general.
What made you actually realize that this was a phenomenon that happened right in the place where you grew up, and then what led you to actually write this book?
My previous book was about colonial St. Louis. It's called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, and it's about how people were really badly behaved. They were doing too many things related to the flesh, gambling, drinking, being licentious. And it's all these French and Spanish records, and I kept on reading about the Big Mound, the Grange de Terre, as kind of a boundary marker. And then it made me just curious, and I started to find all these references. St. Louis was an international tourist destination in the early to 1800s because European aristocrats and royalty and people from the East Coast came to St. Louis to see native peoples who were alive, wandering around, as well as these old mounds. So St. Louis had a really indigenous reputation, and I just became fascinated by how something that was so central to the early development of St. Louis. I mean, people were here, Europeans were here, because native peoples were here, because they wanted them as trading partners. How something that was so central could be so completely erased, both from, it seemed to me, the collective civic memory of St. Louisans, as well as from books about St. Louis.
Do you know of native tribes that are still around that are doing anything other than the Osage, who you've mentioned already, who were working to try to buy the land in South St. Louis? Are there further efforts from other tribes that did used to live in the area to do something with the remains, or to try to find or what have you, the remnants of the mounds that were actually in the area?
Yeah, so not specifically finding the remnants of the mounds. Those have sort of been plotted because there was a map done in 1819 that very clearly designated where they were, and you can kind of lay that over downtown St. Louis and see just where they were. But under the first George Bush, a NAGPRA legislation was signed, and that's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And what NAGPRA does is it provides a process for identifying who are descendant tribes in different areas where there are human remains, funerary objects, sacred cultural objects in museums. The Smithsonian has a lot of stuff. The Missouri History Museum has some. The St. Louis Science Center just repatriated some human remains very recently. The Peabody Museum at Harvard. The Missouri Historical Society has about 12,000 objects in its collections that came from native peoples. And so what NAGPRA outlines is the consultation process through which curators at the Missouri Historical Society contact and consult and work with native tribes and nations that are potentially affiliated. So currently there's a new curator, Brady Wolf, at the Missouri Historical Society, who's charged with kind of getting NAGPRA going again, and he has consulted with, I think he said they're up to about 50 different tribes who are involved in discussions of materials that are here in St. Louis that will ultimately go back to those tribes.
Is there resistance to that actually happening? Because the United States government has a, let's call it, very, very poor history of actually sticking up and standing by the agreements they've had with the native tribes.
Absolutely. And I mean, there was even a Supreme Court decision in the early 1900s that I think it was Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock that basically said the U.S. can unilaterally abrogate any treaty it makes with indigenous peoples. Okay, great. Nope, we don't have to uphold our word. NAGPRA is different. NAGPRA is very complicated and widely criticized in many ways because it's very slow, it's very cumbersome for the consultation process. The power dynamics are a bit unequal if there are competing claims. Museums are the ones who make those decisions. But it seems to me, and that's not my area of expertise, that there is very much a good faith effort now on the part of curators and museum stakeholders and staff to facilitate as expeditiously and respectfully as possible the materials that are in their collections. But it's going to be a very slow process. The Field Museum in Chicago has something like 900,000 objects that belong to indigenous peoples. And often it's not clear where exactly they came from. So it's slow.
So do you have another book that you're working on anywhere near this subject of the mounds in your work as a history professor out at California State University of Long Beach?
Are you on my committee that evaluates me? I'm joking. It takes me a long time to write a book. I've been a faculty member. I've been a historian for more than 30 years. This is my third book, so it's pretty slow. This book really called to me. I really felt compelled. I had kind of a vision of what this book should look like. I felt compelled to do it. Ask me that question again in a couple of years.
Okay. Well, we'll have you back in a couple of years, and we'll get to talk about your next book. Dr. Patricia Cleary, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay.